Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Jazakallah khair to everybody for being patient. We had some technical issues, so we are starting a little bit late. Apologies for that, but I'm glad to see there's a lot of people online right now. So the way it's going to run for those of you attending for the first time, I'm going to be going over this topic in approximately 50 minutes. And the rest of the time, I will try and give to the Q&A, inshallah. So this question, does science disprove God? This is obviously something which a lot of people have come across. They've come across this in perhaps popular YouTube videos, maybe a book, just generally the sort of thing that you may overhear in a coffee house as well. Science has disproved God. God is no longer something which is rational to believe in because there is no scientific evidence for the divine. So what we want to explore today is there any credibility to such an argument? So here's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be deconstructing false assumptions. The first one being science is the only way to find out the truth about the world. How the world works is something that science can actually explain to us and nothing else can. Science is the only yardstick for truth. And this is obviously something which doesn't make any sense. And we can challenge it in many different ways, but it's worth looking at the sort of various discussions and the various routes that we can do it. Secondly, this assumption that science leads to certainty. Science gives us truth with a capital T. Science is there to give us hard, cold, immutable, unchangeable facts about the world. And that is a false assumption, which we also need to challenge. There are some rebuttals, such as science works, so it must be true. What about science in the Quran? Isn't the Quran a book which should tell us about reality? And then another niche sort of contention about Islamic sources which refer to induction. So we're going to be doing a rebuttal of these contentions as well. And in the end, like I said previously, we're going to be doing an extended question and answer session. Now, while you guys are on the webinar, you can ask your questions even now, and when I get to the end, I'll try and answer them then. So let's start off with the first point. Science leads to atheism. There is something about science that leads to the idea that there is no God, there is no creator, there is no designer, that this world and everything in it is not the product of a creator, but just something that happened because of chance or necessity. This is the impression that we have in the world today. We have this impression, and it's being fueled by some very popular figures who supposedly represent the scientific community. However, we're going to see they actually don't. So the claim is, in the ancient world, we didn't know how the world worked. When people didn't know how the world worked, they said, okay, we don't know why this happens, therefore God did it. We don't know why that happens, therefore God did it. So people believed in God because of the gaps in their knowledge, hence the term God of the gaps, which Richard Dawkins has made popular through his book, The God Delusion. However, this particular claim, it went from a claim that was being made by new atheists in the sort of beginning of the 21st century, about 20 years ago, to just becoming a very popular narrative, which is almost taken to be just true. It's just assumed to be true, that as science progresses, the gaps in our knowledge, they recede, and therefore the belief in God also decreases. And this claim is simply untenable, because anybody who thinks about this claim, you would have to assume certain things. And these assumptions and these arguments, they do not follow. So let's look at this. Science is the only way to render the truth about the world in reality. So that's the first point that they make. The second point that they make is, the second premise is, science cannot render truth about God. Meaning, science cannot prove the existence of God. Science cannot disprove the existence of God. Therefore, God doesn't exist. That's the conclusion. So let's look at each one of these. The first is, science is the only way to render the truth about the world in reality. Now, anybody who's done even an elementary course in the philosophy of science, they would just brush that off. I mean, there wouldn't be much discussion about that. They would just recognize that a claim such as that is simply childish. It doesn't make any sense. However, from a popular perspective, this is something a lot of people take for granted. They have this assumption that science does really count as the main yardstick for truth, or the only yardstick for truth. So the first premise is something we're going to be challenging, obviously. Despite its popularity, is something which we can quite easily show is not true. The second premise, which is essentially that science cannot prove God's existence. Now, technically, this is true. However, science not being able to prove God's existence does not go an inch towards the conclusion there is no God. Science cannot prove the existence of morals. That does not mean that morals do not exist. Science cannot prove to us the world is real. That does not mean the world is not real, and so on and so forth. So the second premise obviously has a kernel of truth, but it does not follow from that God does not exist. Okay, so this particular assumption, science is the only way to render truth about the world in reality. This assumption, what is it basically about? It's about making a monopoly of knowledge. It's basically saying, forget epistemology, forget how we know what we know. What we can say is science is the way, the life, and the truth. Science gives us facts. Nothing else can give us the same quality of information. So that assumption is something which, if we break down, then this argument that God doesn't exist, that falls apart. Secondly, this argument is also making an assumption that methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism is the same thing. Now, this is where I really want to make sure everybody's on the same page. You see, sometimes academics, they use the same term to mean something different, and you really have to define what you mean. So we all have heard of naturalism. I'm sure everybody here has heard of naturalism. If you haven't, what is naturalism? Naturalism, despite its sort of benign name, it doesn't just mean nature or studies related to the natural world. Naturalism means there is nothing but nature. In the world, there is nothing except physical matter and processes. That's what makes up the physical, that's what makes up all of reality. Everything can be explained naturalistically. That's naturalism. You can also call that type of naturalism, you can also call it philosophical naturalism. It's the same thing. So when people say you're supporting naturalism, or I'm a naturalist, or for, you know, in this context, philosophical naturalism is what they mean. They mean all of reality can be explained by physical matter and processes, by cause and effect. Nothing to do with God, the immaterial mind, consciousness, objective morals, anything like that. No, it's all about nature and what can be explained naturalistically. So that's philosophical naturalism or naturalism, whatever you want to call it. For clarity, we're going to call it philosophical naturalism. Now, an atheist, they would be somebody who could accept philosophical naturalism, right? So a philosophical naturalist would definitely be an atheist. And somebody who says there is nothing but nature, that person by definition is going to be an atheist, okay? However, the opposite is not necessarily true. An atheist doesn't have to be a philosophical naturalist. Now you may be thinking, how is that possible? If you're a philosophical naturalist, of course you're going to believe in atheism. You're going to believe that atheism is true. But how is it the case that you can be an atheist, you can deny God, but you're not a philosophical naturalist? Well, it can be in the following way. You could have an atheist who says, I believe in jinn, I believe in ghosts. I mean, I know of one atheist who denies God, but they believe in jinn. They do believe jinn exist. So, you know, you don't have to be, if you're an atheist, you don't have to be a philosophical naturalist. But if you're a philosophical naturalist, you have to be an atheist. Okay, I've spent a bit of time on this term, and it's very important to do that because that's going to help us understand what's to come. So what on earth is methodological naturalism? Methodological naturalism is exactly what's in the term method. It is an assumption, it is a governing method that is used within science. Methodological naturalism means a person accepts, for the sake of being in a particular field, that everything that they study can be explained physically. There's a natural cause, there's a natural effect, okay? So a philosophical naturalist is somebody who says nature is all that there is, physical matter and physical processes. A methodological naturalist is somebody who would say, look, while I am doing science, I'm going to assume there is no God, there is no soul, there is no immaterial mind, there are no miracles, there's nothing like that. So somebody who's a methodological naturalist, they don't have to be an atheist. A Muslim, while they're studying science, or a Christian, or a Jewish person, they can be a methodological naturalist while they are within the field of science. Think of it this way. As soon as you enter the scientific domain, whether that's a library, whether that's a laboratory, or it's any other scientific journal, whatever it is, whatever background you come from, a governing assumption in science is methodological naturalism, so you have to assume that nature is all that there is. However, when you leave that domain of science, when you leave at the door, you can believe in God, you can believe in the soul, you can believe in something else. Okay? Another way of thinking about it is this. Imagine you walk into a scientific lab and there's a sign at the door which says the color red does not exist and no one's allowed to talk about red, and every reference, every object that's red is thrown out of the lab. So if anybody walks into that lab with that governing assumption and the fact that red is completely discarded, and then while they're there, they make a belief in their head that red does not exist, that would be a fallacy, because they're taking the assumption that red is not allowed in this room, and they are making a general statement, red does not exist in reality. That's the same with methodological naturalism. As soon as you accept the scientific enterprise and you walk into the world of science, methodological naturalism is the way that science currently functions. It didn't always function that way, but that's the way it currently functions. So if somebody turns around and says methodological naturalism is true, therefore philosophical naturalism is true, they are going from an assumption to a conclusion, which is fallacious reasoning. So let's go over, and by the way, this methodological naturalism, philosophical naturalism can be a little bit tricky. So I'm going to repeat it again later on, but I just wanted to give everybody a sort of heads up before we revisit this. Let's go over the first false assumption. Science is the only way to render truth about the world and reality. And how I want to do this is by getting you guys to think about this. So I'm going to pause and I'm going to let you guys digest and think. If someone wants to comment, more than happy to see people's comments here. But what I try and do, and we can maybe do this more in the Q&A, but I would like some comments. What I want to try and do is get you guys to just interact at this point, because it's very helpful for me to see if you guys are following the argument. So you see a child that is poor, that is handing out food to passers-by, child with some injury, possibly a disease, very poor child, neglected, no one's there to take care of them. You happen to be a millionaire, you happen to have a lot of power, you happen to have a lot of influence, you can change that child's life in a matter of seconds. Say you're a billionaire and you can make that child, you know, live a very comfortable life. Even if you don't want to do that, you know, just help them out. When you see this child and you see it reaching out for help, do you feel like you need to support this child? You need to help this child. You need to follow your instincts and do something good. Do you essentially have a moral obligation to help this child? That is the question. Do you feel, know, and have an obligation to help this child? That's the question. There's about 248 of you in the attendee register that I can see right now. And I've opened up the chat inbox so I can see any comments coming in. Go ahead and type out, do you think we have a moral obligation to help this child? Now, imagine a person staring at this child, wanting to help the child. If you look at this from a purely scientific perspective, you see one human observing another human, an adult observing another child. From a scientific perspective, when you're looking at that, can you see moral obligation? Can you use an instrument to measure the oughtness of helping the child? Or say something horrific happens, like there's somebody that goes up and kicks the child. Can you, using the scientific data you have in front of you, can you label that action evil? Can you say it's wrong? Can you challenge it from that perspective? And the thing is, it's very hard to do so. It's actually very hard to actually say we can see, using the scientific method, that we have a particular obligation. No one can actually do that. No one can actually do that. Nobody can prove to us using the scientific method that there is a moral obligation to help that child. Now, Heather Farouk said, Sam Harris says yes. Good. That's very good. He would probably say yes to this, but the question really is, can he provide a justification for it using science? And the answer to that is no. So let's look at this situation. We have morality. We have something that we know with certainty that moral obligation exists. This is innate. This is hard to deny. This is something which all human beings would appreciate in whatever part of their life that they're going through, whether they're young, they're old, whoever they are going to say, yes, we have an obligation to help this child. No one's going to say no to that, okay? Unless someone's, I don't know, they're psychopathic or something, right? They just completely free of any emotions. But science cannot explain to us the existence of moral obligation or of the existence of right and wrong, let alone the obligation. Because remember, for you to be a moral person, be a good person, it's not only you have to acknowledge the existence of good and bad objectively, you also have to have an obligation to follow that instinct of right and wrong. It's not something which you can just believe in good and bad without actually taking action. Science is amoral from that perspective. Now, that doesn't mean science is immoral. Two very different things. It's amoral. Science presumes morality. Science cannot prove its existence. Now, what's interesting, all across the world, if you look at the biggest movements that are happening all across the world, whether those are historical movements such as the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, or whether it's a social media campaign, the Me Too campaign, or the Black Lives Matter campaign, whatever it is, these massive social movements are driven by morals, are driven by a sense of justice, by a sense of right and wrong. However, science cannot in any way show that those things are true. Another way of thinking about it and how it impacts science is the following. Say somebody comes up to you and says, we should follow science because it gives us truth. And you turn around and say, no, I rather not, even if science gives us truth, I rather believe in falsehood than believe in truth. I rather stick to falsehood. That person's obviously going to turn around and say to you, what on earth are you talking about? You should follow the truth. And you could say, well, why? Why do I have to follow the truth? And the only real answer the person can give you is because it's good to follow the truth, because it's the right thing to do. Meaning truth itself, following truth itself, is a moral virtue. It is good to follow truth. It is bad to follow falsehood. So science, when people are doing science or they're telling us we need to follow science or whatever it is, even that is a morally loaded term. But if we say science is the only route of knowledge, morality goes out the window. And not only does that mean the vast majority of human behavior is inexplainable, it also means science itself is undermined. Because we do good and bad, because we follow truth and reject falsehood because of the fact that we believe truth is intrinsically valuable and good and falsehood is not. Okay, next question. Science cannot tell us everything about the world. Science cannot tell us everything that is rational. That's the point we're making. For those people who say science can, science is the be and the end all, it's the alpha and the omega, we can give them historical examples and say, prove this using the scientific method. So, did Genghis Khan exist? Think about this question. Do you right now believe Genghis Khan existed? In the comments, please put yes or no, whether you think Genghis Khan existed or he did not exist. Yes, yes, yes. Someone said yes, sir. That is so polite. Unbelievable politeness there. Yes, yes. Okay, everyone's saying yes. Subhi Hussein is saying yes, he existed due to historical reports. Okay, so everyone else is saying the same thing. Okay, no problem. So what is the scientific evidence? And I want you to take a moment and think about this. What is the scientific evidence for the existence of Genghis Khan? Okay, give it a moment and type out the answer. What are the answers that we're getting? Yes, yes, that's fine. Does it apply to Hitler? It applies to every historical figure. Someone said, wish he didn't. Yeah, okay. So Soha Hussein is saying the fact that his descendants are alive today. Interesting, interesting. So his descendants being alive today, how does that prove? So let's just say we go up to somebody that claims to be his descendant. We have a physical specimen in front of us, but how does that prove that Genghis Khan existed? Maybe Genghis Khan is a myth. How do we know he existed? Zainab is saying swords. Okay, so we have swords. Samia is saying historical chain of events. Very good. That's testimony. But that is not science. Muhammad is saying no scientific proof. People have observed his existence once and they told us. Good. But them telling us over the centuries is not scientific evidence. It's historical evidence. It's testimonial evidence. Testimony is how we know the majority of the things that we know. His fossils. That's a good answer. Well, firstly, there isn't enough time for him to fossilize. However, I get your point. His grave, right? His grave. That's what you mean. So where's his grave? Mongolia. Okay, where do we go in Mongolia to see his grave? Well, actually, no one knows where his grave is. He was secretly buried. Even if we knew where his grave was, how would we know that's Genghis Khan and not somebody else? So there's no scientific evidence for his existence. There's only historical evidence. Now, someone said something. DNA sample for Genghis Khan. No DNA sample for Genghis Khan. Okay, even if we could go and find his bones and do a DNA analysis, how would we know that's Genghis Khan? We wouldn't. Carbon dating. Okay, if we do carbon dating on a deceased body and we find out that he existed around the time that historically we know Genghis Khan did, then firstly, that's still not scientific evidence because we're using history to
to corroborate the idea that that's Genghis Khan. Secondly, how do we know that's Genghis Khan's body? So I think everybody's on the same page. Testimony, testimony, testimony. MashaAllah, a lot of you guys are on the ball. Great. So the existence of Genghis Khan, the existence of Plato, the existence of Aristotle, the existence of Jesus alayhi salam, the existence of any historical figure or event is something that's not known through science. It is known purely through history, through testimony. In fact, this is very interesting. Say you are a physicist and you study cosmology. Someone comes up to you and says, do you believe in Darwinian evolution as a valid scientific theory? Do you believe in the existence of Charles Darwin? Do you believe he went on the Beagle? Do you believe he collected beetles and specimens in the Galapagos Islands, and you know, he did this and he did that and his theory works? And you know, a physicist would say, yeah, of course I believe in Darwin's theory. Yeah, of course I believe in Darwin. However, even that scientific theory that they are saying they believe in that theory not because they did the experiments for Darwinian evolution, but because of testimony. So even scientists have to rely upon the testimony of other scientists in their scientific field. No scientist can continue as a scientist if they challenge every single piece of scientific information they get and they decide to do an experiment. You'll get nowhere. You'll get a scientist redoing all of the experiments that the previous scientists are handing down to them, and they'll never gain any new information. So of course, science itself relies on testimony. All right, cool. So let's do this. Shahnoza said, that's ironic. Scientists should just dismiss these early scientists because there is no evidence to prove it other than testimony. Calling Darwinism Darwinism would be a paradox in that case. Excellent. That's exactly the point. Do you have a great grandmother? So let's try it. Who believes they do? Mariam said yes. Who is sure that they have? Yes, 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 yes. Numer Khan said no. Okay. So why did you say no? Probably said Fakhir Ali. Fakhir Ali. How to pronounce that name? Most people said yes. Someone said no. Again, probably just in jest. Rightio. Everyone said yes. Okay, give me a shred of scientific evidence that you have 8 generations going back, you have a great grandmother. Give me a shred of evidence for that. Scientific evidence, guys. That's what I'm looking for. Hiba said she has to exist by default if I exist. Perfect. Totally agree. However, Hiba, what is the scientific evidence? If you exist, therefore you must have had parents, and your parents must have had parents going back 7 generations, and then you have a great, great grandmother. That's fine. I get it. It's fine. But that's not scientific evidence. That's you using deductive logic. So give me scientific evidence. All right, guys, let's do it this way, right? Everyone's saying no. Pedigree chart or genes? Hiba says. Fine. But the pedigree chart or genes assumes she exists. Before you go around looking for her genes, you make the assumption she exists. But that's the very question that we are asking. Does she exist? Reproduction is the evidence. You mean that going back, she must have existed because people come through reproduction. That's fine, but that's again deductive logic. Interesting by Osama. Isn't deductive logic part of science? Yes, it is. It's a presupposition of science. Deductive logic is not science. Science needs inductive and deductive and abductive logic and mathematics and testimony and other presuppositions. But those are not science. Those are presuppositions. Parent, Zainab says fossils. Someone loves fossils here. Yeah, that's fine. What about a painting of her drawn at the time? Very interesting way of putting it, Fawzia. Okay, so we have a painting. First off, painting people, is it halal? That's the question we got to ask. And of course it's not. Anyway, suppose we have a painting of her. How do we know that's her? How do we know she existed? Scientific reasoning includes deductive reasoning. Exactly. But deductive reasoning on its own is not scientific information or scientific argument. DNA test. Okay, so this is Ali Imran Malik. So Ali Imran Malik says DNA test. All right, fine. Let's go do a DNA test. Let's go see if her DNA matches yours. Okay, so this is in particular to brother Ali Imran Malik. So Ali Imran, where is your great grandmother buried? What country? What city? What particular area? Where is the grave? Chances are you don't even know her name. You have no idea her lifestyle, who she got married to, anything. Her clothes, her perfume, her whatever. You know nothing. So how would you do a DNA test? How would you go around looking for that? And even if you were to go on a DNA hunt, and if you somehow knew that she was in a particular part of the world, you still have to assume that she exists. So I think everybody understands here that this is not something which science can prove or disprove. Let's move on. All right, guys, Micronesia. Micronesia. Is this a real country? So right now you can open up another browser, Google Micronesia, and please let me know, is Micronesia a real country? Heather Farouk says no. Okay. Who else? Micronesia, nope. Nope. Fantasyland. So far the answers coming is no. It's a micro country, lol, not a real country. Ooh, some people are saying yes. Yes. Wow, we have a bit of ikhtilaf here. Very nice. It's not on the map. Some people are saying I googled it. Yes, yes, no idea. It's an Oceania according to Ajmal Ishaq. But Wikipedia says it is. It does exist. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Now what we're seeing is vast majority of people are saying, okay, Halima Hassan is saying Allah only knows. Perfect. What a beautiful answer. Allah only knows is the answer to all questions. And I agree. However, I'm asking all of you guys right now, according to the best of your knowledge, does it exist or not? Google it. Look up Micronesian people. Do Micronesian people exist? Look up people who do vlogging for Micronesia. Is there anybody that's been doing vlogs about Micronesia? Google says yes. Rizwan Ali says maybe it's the Dajjal's Island. Maybe, bro, maybe. Go have a look. Yes, Googled it. It's in Oceania. Okay, fine. Everybody's now saying yes, pretty much. Okay. What is the evidence that Micronesia is a country? Well, Google says it. It's on the map. We have vloggers that have gone there, XYZ. None of this is scientific evidence. If you right now are staring at Google and Google's telling you, here's an image of Micronesia, that is not scientific evidence, because that could be Indonesia. That could be a picture of Malaysia. That could be a picture of, I don't know, Sialkot. Yeah, it could be a picture of any part of the world. Well, Sialkot technically is not an island, but you guys get my point. It could be any part of the world, right? It could be any part of the world. So you looking at these pictures does not mean that it is scientific evidence, even though it's right in front of you. Let's move on to the next example. Some people are going to start freaking out because this is going to remind them of their maths days. So solve this equation. Okay, Nadia Karabeg said 7. Mesa said 10. Yeah, that's great, guys. Fantastic. But that's not the question. That's not the question. My question is, can you solve this using science? Not the fact that you guys are great mathematicians, which mashallah you are. Mesa wrote 191. People are still saying 7, 1. Guys, this is like, this is like the story of the sleepers in the cave, yeah? We're not asking, you guys are answering the question directly. What I want to know is, solve this equation using science, guys. That's what I want from you. Ahmad Wahid says maths is science. Interesting. Maths is science. Now, obviously, I've been saying throughout that maths and logic and testimony and metaphysical, all of these things are things science presumes. But Ahmad Wahid is saying maths is science. Who agrees with the idea that maths is science? No, we can't. Maths is science. Science is testimony. I don't understand that comment. A scientific truth is not a mathematical truth. So of course you disagree. Yes, no, yes, I don't. Maths is equal to science according to Omar Sharif. Don't agree. No, it isn't. No, it's not. No, I don't. Okay, good. I like having ikhtilaf. I like causing disagreements. Okay. So 1 plus 1 is 2. Okay. You take one banana, you get another banana, you get 2 bananas. You take one razor, get another razor, you get 2 razors. Take one tree, get another tree, get 2 trees. Okay. Is it science? Is it the case that you have to get 2 objects together and then know that 1 plus 1 is 2? Or is 1 plus 1 is 2? Is that true, independent of observations? That's the question. Sounds like a tricky question, but think about it. Do you need to always reconfirm 1 plus 1 is 2? Or is it the case that even before looking at the world, you know 1 plus 1 is 2? You don't have to get 2 bananas and then reconfirm the formula 1 plus 1 is 2. Or is it the case that you do? Yes, it's independent. Okay, good. That's what Hiba Anam says. Yes, it's independent. That's exactly the point. It is independent. It is universal, like Hamza says. Okay. Algebra, mathematics, all of these things are not science. Science presupposes them. 1 plus 1 is true, independent of any observation. There is no observation in the world of you counting 2 bananas and then making from 1 plus 1 is 2 to one day you get 2 bananas and it doesn't equal 2. Right? It is not science. This is actually different. This is mathematics. All right, let's do the next point. Can you solve a logical argument using science? Can you show why an argument is necessarily true using science? All humans are mortals. Socrates is immortal, therefore Socrates is human. Yeah. So a logical argument that flows, can you use science to prove that it flows? Or is it the case that it's true regardless of what scientists say? Is it the case that science cannot prove these things, cannot prove cause and effect? It has to, who's saying this? Bilal Sheikh is saying, yeah, we'll talk about cause and effect briefly when we come to metaphysics. However, a logical argument, for it to flow and for the sound premises and the valid argument to flow and necessarily lead to the conclusion, has nothing to do with science. Absolutely nothing to do with science. Science requires it, but science cannot prove it. All right, let's go to something more tasty. Cake. Your mom makes you a cake and it says, I love you. And can you use scientific evidence, such as what temperature the cake was baked at, the nutritional value of the cake, the chemical composition of the icing, whatever? Can you use that to explain why your mom made you the cake? Of course not. That's a personal explanation involving an agent, which is free of the scientific inquiry from that perspective. That's a question to do with why. Science is an attempt to explain how the world works, an attempt to explain how the world works. Science cannot explain to us why. The why is beyond the science. And likewise, how does it taste? What is the third person subjective conscious experience? That is again something that science cannot tell you. Questions such as, is the world real? Do other minds exist? Is the past real? Does causality exist? Again, this is free of the scientific. This is not something that science can address. Okay, science has to presume these metaphysical things. Shanoza Abidova is saying self-evident truths. Yeah, essentially, the world being real is a self-evident truth, causality, self-evident truth, and so on and so forth. And the whole idea that science is the only route of knowledge or is the only way to find out about the world. What about this statement, science is the only way of finding out about the world? Is that statement something that can be scientifically proven? No, it can't. It can't. So it's actually shooting yourself in the foot. It's self-defeating. The second assumption is about conflating methodological and philosophical naturalism. Like I explained before, methodological naturalism is an assumption of how the scientific enterprise works. You assume there's no God, you assume there's no immaterial mind, no objective morals, nothing supernatural. Philosophical naturalism is the belief that in totality of existence there is nothing but nature. One's an assumption, one's a belief. A Muslim or a Jewish person or a Christian person can be a methodological naturalist, but not a philosophical naturalist. A philosophical naturalist would be an atheist. These two are separate and distinct, like I mentioned, and to conflate them is a fallacy. And this is interesting that you'll find academics basically saying the same thing, such as Scott Todd. He says, you can be a scientist and you can believe in methodological naturalism, but outside of methodological naturalism, you can believe in God. Michael Roos also admits that naturalism, in this case, philosophical naturalism, is not is not a fact about the world that science has proven to us, but is actually a belief. Philosophical naturalism is not something proven, it's actually a belief. So let's go over some objections now. Okay, Ahmad Wahid is asking, is it okay for a Muslim to assume that God doesn't exist? Of course it's not. Methodological naturalism is just a governing paradigm within science that is currently the way that science operates. Should that be, if Muslims controlled the entire scientific enterprise, if they were the forerunners in the science, if they were the ones publishing the papers and doing the cutting edge research, and like they were in the past, would they accept methodological naturalism? Probably not. You could argue that they wouldn't at all, right? And they didn't in the past, certainly. So methodological naturalism is definitely something which we can discuss in the Q&A, because it is a problematic point. So science works, so it must be true. That's the objection. However, here's the thing. Historically, we know of many scientific theories which were successful but turned out to be false. Phlogiston was a theory in chemistry which helped us discover the element nitrogen, which is a real thing, but phlogiston turned out to be a wrong theory. Sometimes wrong models give us better results than models which are supposedly more true. So this whole idea that science works, so therefore must be true, this is simply not true. Scientific theories work even when they're wrong, and even when they contradict each other. So the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics, both of these are very successful theories in physics, but they contradict each other at a fundamental level. They both can't be true, but they're both very successful. Look, science, how does it work? A scientist would gather data. Say a scientist wants to know what color are swans. He goes and collects 1,000 swans, works out they're white. Then he collects another 1,000, works out they're white. Likewise, he puts together 1,000,000 swans, works out they're white. From a limited set of data of 1,000,000, he goes to the general conclusion, the infinite conclusion, that all swans are white. But one day he can come across a black swan. So this is the problem with the problem of induction. You can always make an induction based upon a large set of data which can be challenged by future data. You can always get a black swan challenging your theory. Likewise, there are alternatives to our best theories which fit the data and is sometimes empirically equivalent alternatives. How do you decide? Well, you have to decide on one, but that doesn't mean that's the only one. And there's a lot of philosophers who actually write about this. You know, I put in the quote of Carl Stanford, Elliot Sober. This is standard. Everybody knows this, right? Everybody knows theories work even when they're wrong. Everybody knows theories, even if they work, even if they're successful, even if they have predictive power, doesn't mean they're true. And of course, this is something which is obvious, yeah, that the same data, you can come up with alternative theories. Why does this happen? Why is it that something can work and can be overturned? Like I mentioned, it's because science cannot ever give us truth in the first place, because it's based upon induction. You gather your data, you work out all the swans are white, you come across a black swan, you have to revise. However, it working doesn't mean it's proven, doesn't mean it's true, it just means it works. So science is there to give you workable models which can then change. It's not there to give you immutable scientific facts. This is extremely important to understand. Science is revisable. This is something which philosophers often speak about, and they warn against.
using words like proof for science. Okay, what about the science in the Quran, the so-called scientific miracles? This we have a separate webinar for, and that goes through a lot of detail. However, I'm going to cover this briefly just to, get you guys interested. So the thing is, anybody that says there is a scientific miracle in the Quran, say the universe is expanding, that supposed scientific miracle is based upon a couple of assumptions. The first assumption is that if they say the universe is expanding, then they are assuming that that conclusion is certain that the universe is expanding. Well, right now there's a consensus that the universe is expanding, but in the future, scientists, because of the problem of induction, underdetermination, and other problems in philosophy of science, it could be the scientists turn around and say the universe is not expanding. So this supposed miracle is no longer a miracle. Secondly, is the Quran only saying the universe is expanding? Well, if you look at the tafsir and you look at the lexical analysis of those verses that people are pointing towards, it doesn't only say, or it's not the only interpretation to say the universe is expanding. That verse could also mean the universe is vast, in which case it's no longer a miracle, because it could mean something else. So the Quran is timeless, as Hisham is saying, and this whole idea of scientific miracles does not make any sense, right? Because it's based on those false assumptions that this is the only meaning of that verse, and this scientific verse will this scientific statement is true. Both of these things are highly questionable, highly questionable. So scientific miracles of the Quran is not an argument, which is problematic. Another false assumption, another false objection is Islamic sources refer to induction, right? So how do you put together your narrations for the Prophet, peace be upon him? How do you put together hadith, right? Well, you go by this person heard from this person, heard from this person, heard from this person. Isn't that induction? So when you're challenging induction, aren't you challenging Islam? No. There's a difference between inductive reasoning and inductive argumentation and mirroring. When a particular Sahabi says, I heard the Prophet ﷺ say X, and then they tell their child, and the child then tells their children in the future, my father said that he heard the Prophet ﷺ say X. That is testimonial knowledge. That's not induction. You're not adding anything new. You're not saying my father heard the Prophet ﷺ say X and X1. That would be wrong. That would be something that's very problematic. So it's a false assumption to say we are using induction in the same sense of science. We are not. That's actually a misunderstanding. So because we started late, I went slightly over time. It's 8:07 now. And I tried to, cover the presentation in as much detail as I can in the time that I have. But what I really am looking forward to is the question and answer sessions, because that's really where we're going to learn and where we're going to, challenge and see what's going on and whether the arguments are coherent and they actually make sense and they actually work. So let's stick to some questions related to, and let's try and stick to the topic, because sometimes questions, they go a little bit tangential. So Basit Rahman is saying, a lot of naturalists also use the word humanism or describe themselves as humanists. Can you explain what they mean by that? And does this have anything to reliance on science? Okay, humanism is a philosophy, and how that's related to naturalism, well, humanists are generally atheists, and that's about it. And of course, humanists would rely on science, and you would have humanists who would have an over reliance on science and have the problem of scientism and whatnot. I don't really need to go into any more detail. I think that's sufficient to answer the question here.
So brother Issam Saleh says, what constitutes scientific evidence? What needs to be fulfilled in order to conclude that something is scientific evidence? Brilliant question. I really love this question. Well, it would have to fit what we call the scientific method. Now, technically, there is no one scientific method. There's a series of methods. However, you would have to have induction. You'd have to go from the known to the unknown. You'd have to have a model, a hypothesis, something which is falsifiable and testable, not falsifiable in the sense that, you know, the old Popperian way, but still something that fits that general category of things. Okay, testimony, logic, deductive reasoning, you know, self-evident truths, metaphysics, morals, all of these things, 99% of the beliefs that we hold to be rational as human beings are not scientific. They fall into these other roots of knowledge. Yeah, so they don't constitute scientific evidence. And a lot of people, they mistake those things that we know through other roots of knowledge, they constitute that scientific knowledge, when it's not. Even when it comes to the earth goes around the sun, that's 100% scientific knowledge. No, it's not. That's just observation. Science is theoretical. It's where you have induction. It's not as simple as observation. If I'm doing plumbing and I'm using observation, that doesn't make me a scientist, right? And this is a general contention which people like Massimo Piglucci, who's an atheist philosopher, uses against those people who try and broaden out science and try and encompass it in everything. Okay. Arbitrar saying, can you see my question here? Yes, I can, but I can't see the question that you wrote. Doesn't believing in God entail that things can be unexplainable in science, like miracles and ancient stories? So science itself cannot disprove God, but the things some religions claim can seem very unscientific and impossible. Yes, absolutely. So for example, the virgin birth. The fact that Maryam alayhi salam gave birth without having intercourse, without being unchaste, which we believe 100% as Muslims, yet scientifically, no scientist would accept that. No scientist would accept that. That is true. So the question is, why do we believe it? Well, we believe it because we believe in the Quran. We believe the Quran to be the miracle of Allah, and Allah is the one who put together the laws of nature, which is what science needs in order to make sense. Allah can create a child using a man and a woman, and Allah can create a child only using a man or a woman or whoever He wants. Allah can do whatever He wants, right? So that's the issue here. Methodological naturalism rules out miracles, rules out God, but that doesn't mean God and miracles do not exist. It's two different things here. I hope that makes sense. Nuran? Arman Zafar says, can there be a deductive conclusion based on inductive premises? Yes, it can. You can have probabilistic premises and a deductive conclusion. Can you explain the last part about induction again, please? Okay, the last part I was saying was the Islamic sources of knowledge, such as the preservation of the Quran, the preservation of narrations of Prophet ﷺ, hadith. These are not based on induction in the classical scientific context. Yeah, it's not like that. It's actually testimony. It's not scientific induction that we use to preserve these things. When are you coming to Pakistan? I don't know. It's 12:35 in India. Thank you very much for telling me that. I didn't understand the part about, do other minds exist? Good question, Nabi and Nabi Ibrahim. Okay. Do other minds exist? Are other people zombies, or do they really have a mind? Now, that's a philosophical question. That's something which obviously Muslims believe in, and other people can argue philosophically for and against it. But it's not a scientific question. Science is based on methodological naturalism. For scientists, The brain at work is what the mind is. The mind is the brain at work. They won't have a belief in consciousness, in the immaterial mind or the soul or God. None of these things exist. Aisha Jah, what's induction in the last slide you talked about? What I was saying was, people may make a contention that Islamic sources such as the narrations of the Prophet ﷺ are based on induction, but these are not. That's what I was referring to. Alvina Siddiqui says, question about morality and science. What would you argue for those who say that morality is something humans developed over time through collective experience, e.g. trial and error, learning what benefits individual societies most, and the moral obligations is taught? Some things considered immorals, some cultures considered others. That's an argument I've been curious about. All right, good question. Well, there's a certain kernel of truth in that, from the perspective that morals are taught and morals change from culture to culture. However, core morality is something that all human beings know, and it's not something that we know through experience or trial and error. You don't need to kill people to know that murder is wrong. That is something which is fitri, which is natural, which is innate. So core morality, such as you have the right to what you've earned, don't harm a child, especially your own, don't kill an innocent person, stuff like this, core morals are universal. People may disagree on moral preferences, right, or due to their beliefs or customs or rituals or philosophies or whatever, but core morality is something everybody knows about. How to benefit from science without leading me to atheism? Well, it's by understanding that science has nothing to do with atheism. This from Maryam Ashraf. That's the answer. Science has nothing to do with atheism. Understand the philosophy of science, get past all the rhetoric and the nonsense that they try and push out, and you'll see, if anything, science is indirect evidence for God's existence, as opposed to being anti-God. Why good and bad can't be subjective? Okay, if someone wants to say they're subjective, then truth has no value, good has no value, bad has no value. Having a conversation where you're trying to arrive at truth is absolutely pointless, because truth and falsehood are subjective. Life is totally meaningless and pointless, and everything has no value. That's why it's ridiculous in this idea that everything's subjective. Are not photos and video films material proofs of a historical person? Yes, they are. But why would that be scientific evidence? Say there's a video of Hitler. How do I know that's Hitler? I know that through testimony, not through that videotape itself. Imagine someone that's never seen Hitler and they see that video. They won't say Hitler. You'll have to tell them using testimonial evidence. Why and how do false models of science still work? Well, scientists are trying to approximate to truth, and a false model is better than a falser model. So you can, of course, have results coming which are beneficial and true from something which is not entirely true itself. What about established scientific facts? Waqas Farid says. Okay, so I'm guessing you're saying that those are proven. Okay, give me an example of an established scientific fact. Osama Ismail is asking, how can a Muslim be a methodological naturalist and at the same time believe death has no cure according to authentic narration of Prophet ﷺ, and or robots can never be conscious, which if happens, this will undermine the entire theological project? Yeah, a Muslim cannot really, I mean, it's very, look, when you're working within science, you can tacitly, you can accept what everybody's doing in terms of methodological naturalism. However, you don't have to accept philosophical naturalism. Don't mistake the assumption for the conclusion. And should we have methodological naturalism in science? That's an open question. As Muslims, I'm saying. I'm from Pakistan. Here we have a scientist, Pervez Hoodboy. He believes that Islamic culture has inhibited the development of scientific environment. What do you say to this? Please take my question. Okay, he's made these claims. He's made ridiculous claims in the past as well about Imam Ghazali, rahimullah, and many other people. And it's not based on a shred of evidence. It's based on something known as the classical narrative, which has been thoroughly debunked by Orientalists. And it's just absolutely unbelievable that people can get away with this type of nonsense in the 21st century without a shred of evidence. So yeah, it's just a classical narrative being recycled. Please, can you give a summary of everything? That will be very difficult to do. I've only got a few minutes left. Science doesn't give you truth. Science is not the only root of knowledge. Science does not undermine God. That's essentially what I'm saying. What books can you recommend about the philosophy of science? Well, there are some books that I was mentioning earlier. Elliot Sober, Evidence in Science. This is a very good book. Samir Okasha, a very good, very short introduction, Oxford University, books like that. Could you use the existence of self-evident truths for the argument that science cannot explain some of the things, but it doesn't mean the things don't exist? Exactly, of course you can. This is from Halima Hassan. Of course you can. You could simply show, look, the world being real is self-evidently true, morals self-evidently true, and that clearly, and even the fact that uniformity of nature or truth is valuable. Yeah, there's so many self-evident truths we can use. Can you explain if deductive and inductive reasoning is a science or not? Inductive and deductive reasoning are not science. I'm not going to explain what those are. Those are very easy. You can Google them, and I explained them. Well, I didn't explain them. It's sort of given that. Look, induction is probabilistic. Deduction is not. But anyway, it's not science. Can we justify moral rules by the fact that preservation of feeling evolves thus according to Darwin's theory? No, because that would be the naturalistic fallacy. You can come to my, this is a brilliant time to do some shameless promotion. So Darwinian Delusions is my channel, and I cover these sorts of things in more detail there. But long story short, you can't go from supposed facts about the world to the way the world should be. That would be the naturalistic fallacy, as David Hume put it, right? So you can't go from this is natural, therefore it's good, or this is the way things are, this is the way the world should be. You can't go from is to should. That's a fallacy, right? Justice Cupid is saying, can you restate what you said about morality in science? Particularly about morality goes out the window. Is it an assumption made? You said something around that. Okay. If you say science is the only way of gaining anything that's true, then what does science tell you about morality? Absolutely nothing. Therefore, morality doesn't exist. That's what I was saying. Morality does not exist if you say science is the only root of knowledge. And therefore, you undermine science itself, because science is supposed to be, there to benefit mankind, which is something good, and is there to try and arrive at as much truth as we can about the world, truth with a small t, not capital T, because science will always change. However, that's assuming truth is good, which is again not science, that's morality. A lot of these questions are very similar, so I'm skipping them and I'm just reading them. Can you explain the difference between miracle and paranormal activities? Right, that's not in the scope of this webinar. I'd rather not do that right now, although that's quite interesting. Maybe I can do that later on my own channel, Darwinian Delusions. Second plug. Hamza's next door. He may just come in here and drag me by the collar and throw me out, but shameless promotion galore. Anyway, and in that context, science would be historical. Yes. Is science observation only without maths or deduction? There is no science. No, science is not observation only. You need inference. You need to go from the limited to the unlimited. Can science prove God? No. Science doesn't prove in the first place. And God is unseen, so why would science, which only looks at the observable, be able to prove the unobservable? It doesn't make any sense. We don't need science to prove God. We know of God's existence because of the fitrah, and we know of God's existence because of other arguments which are philosophical in nature, nothing to do with science. How to rationalize revelation from God, not part of this webinar. We could do that in another webinar, and we do have that. Jazakallah khair, brother. What about the scientific miracle of the Quran in regards to the explanation of the human embryo? Nope, scientific miracles in the Quran is a weak argument, and there's a separate webinar on this, you'll see, and I mentioned it previously because you're making certain assumptions about science, which is certain, and you're also making certain assumptions about the word of Allah, which cannot be justified either. Alex Parker is asking, I realize that science cannot justify logic and reason. However, is this something that an atheist worldview can justify at all? Alex, that is a brilliant question, and the answer to that is no. Logic and reason cannot be justified under a naturalistic worldview. I'm going to go off on a complete tangent. It's going to take me a long time to explain why, but the short answer is no. The longer answer is no. And the longer answer is jump onto the YouTube page, Darwinian Delusions, and you'll be able to actually get a thorough answer on that. So should we seek scientific miracles from the Quran? The answer is no, based upon what I said previously, and we have a separate webinar on this. It's coming to the last few seconds, so I'm going to try and go through all the questions, all the repeat questions I'm going to ignore. I'm going to ignore that one. Ignore that one. Ignore that one. Ignore that one. A lot of these questions, guys, I think I've answered, maybe because I answered them in that order. Is the multiverse scientific? That's not part of this webinar. I can't answer that. What should be the reaction towards the position science in the Quran often is successful but fundamentally is wrong? New webinar for that. If someone says we are not proven it through science, what is beyond Big Bang? Then it does not mean the beginning is from God. Maybe you haven't reached that level of knowledge. Yeah, that's fine. Doesn't mean anything. That's not an argument. I can see they would say that, but it's not true. Okay, a lot of these questions are the same questions which I've answered, so I'd like to end it here. Jazakallah khair to everybody for attending this webinar. I really enjoyed it. It was great fun, and a lot of you were interacting. And we have a whole set of great webinars from some really good brothers upcoming. Make sure you attend those as well. And do give us your feedback and let us know how you felt, whether you were empowered, whether you understood everything, so we can improve. Jazakallah khair, everybody. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.